Have you ever heard a jazzer play a hip melodic reharmonization in the middle of a solo and think, wait, what did they just do? Well, it's not magic, it's simply about knowing what chords to swap and when to hold back. In this video, I'll break down how you can spice up your solos by reharmonizing chords like a pro. You're going to use tricks that sound advanced, but are really easy and feel supernatural. So the first question you might ask yourself is, when should I play a reharmonization and when should I hold back? Well, the answer is really it's up to you. Jazz language is so flexible when you're improvising that it's totally okay for you to superimpose a reharmonization basically whenever you want. But my personal advice is don't overdo it. Reharmonizations are kind of like spice when you're cooking. You want to get the right amount of spice. Too much spice and you overwhelm the other flavors in the dish and all you get is spice. So a little bit goes a long way and you probably want to spread out your reharmonizations. If you go overboard, it might be too much. The second question you might want to ask is, what if I'm not a rhythm section player and I'm doing a chord reharmonization in my melodic solo and the rhythm section doesn't know that I'm about to do it? Well, no problem there. First of all, like I said already, jazz language is really flexible. And every reharmonization we're going to talk about today is totally fine for you to do regardless of whether or not the rhythm section goes along with you. That being said, as you play with more and more advanced players, hopefully you have the opportunity to do that in your life and your career, a good jazz musician will hear the chord reharmonization implying during your solo, and they'll play something that will support it or that at least won't get in your way. Okay, so don't worry about that. Let's start talking about some of these effective reharmonizations and why they're so hip. The first one I want to talk about is using what we call diatonic substitutions. Diatonic is just a fancy word that means in the same key. And the one we're going to talk about is substituting a minor chord for a major chord. So, for example, if I'm playing a song and there's a C major chord, right? C major, and I'll make it a C major 7 with a ninth added. Okay? The diatonic substitution for that chord is an E minor or an A minor. Why? Because if we think about our basic 7th chords, C major 7 shares 3 notes with E minor, E, G, and B, right? And C major 7 shares 3 notes with A minor, C, E, and G. And here's A minor. So, since C major 7 shares 3 notes with E minor 7 and with A minor 7, and because they come from the same key center of C major, what this means is that anytime I see a C major chord, in my head I can switch it to thinking about an E minor chord or an A minor chord, and this changes my melodic approach because I have different vocabulary that I play over an E minor chord and an A minor chord versus a C major chord. So for example, if I think a C major chord, I might do a C major arpeggio like this. Something like that. When I switch to A minor, if I'm going to do an arpeggio, now in my head, even though the chord is still a C major chord, I'm going to play an A minor arpeggio in different inversions. And that still is going to fit over that chord. So here is the concert B flat, so it's C for me on tenor. There's that C major chord for me, but I'm going to treat it like an A minor. And that fits really well. So now I can think about that chord as switch it to A minor in my head, and I can play all my A minor melodic vocabulary. Including even throwing in maybe some minor blues sounds that are going to still fit over this chord. So I've completely switched my thinking and it opens up new melodic territory for me. So chord substitution number 1, our diatonic substitution. Whenever you have a major chord, you can play the minor chord a minor third down or a major third up. So if you think in Roman numerals, my 3 minor chord or my 6 minor chord are good substitutions for a 1 major chord. Okay, let's talk about chord substitution number 2. When I'm playing solos, a 2-5-1 in my head, the 2-5 part of that 2-5-1 I think of as a chunk, as a its own unit of musical harmonic vocabulary. So whenever you're playing that 2-5, you can always ignore the 2 chord, okay? Substitution number 2, therefore, is ignore the 2 chord. So we're going to think about a 5 chord substituting for a 2 chord, and this 5 chord is the 2 chord that would go with that 2 chord. So for example, if I'm thinking about a 2-5-1 in the key of C major, right, it's going to be D minor 7, going to G7, going to C major 7. So the 2-5 part is the D minor 7, G7, okay? D minor 7 and G7 in this context, they both come from the key of C major, so I can just ignore that 2 chord and treat the 2-5 as one giant 5 chord. How does this help? Well, melodically, it opens up new territory. First of all, it simplifies the chord progression, so I don't have to think so much. I can only worry about 1 chord instead of having to worry about 2 chords. And second of all, now it opens up the possibility that all of my G7 vocabulary can be played over the entire 2-5. So in practice, what does this mean as a melodic instrument? Very often when I have a 2-5, I'm going to play 2-5 vocabulary. So I'll play something that really spells out the 2 chord and then the 5 chord. For a 1-bar 2-5, maybe something like this. Or, and you can really hear the 2 chords down in there and the 5 chords down. So what I'm doing is I'm going to now ignore that 2 chord and just play my G7 vocabulary. Simplifies it. So that 2-5, I'm now treating as just a 5, right? Very, very, very powerful substitution. Remember, you can always ignore the 2 chord. Okay, let's talk about chord substitution number 3. This is a powerful one in jazz. Whenever you have a dominant 7th chord that is functioning as 5 and it goes to its 1 chord, you can alter that dominant 7 chord. And by that, I mean you can turn it into a 5-7 flat 9. Okay? So whenever I have a G7 chord going to a C chord, and it doesn't matter if it's going to a C major, to a C dominant, a C minor, as long as it's G7 going to some type of C chord, I can force that G7 chord to be altered. And by that I mean I'm going to turn it into a G7 flat 9. So there's my G7 flat 9 going to a C major 7 chord. By changing that G7 to a G7 flat 9, now in my head I open up a whole new universe of melodic possibilities because now I can pick different scale choices. I can pick several scale choices that incorporate that flat 9 because in order to satisfy the requirements of G7 flat 9, the only notes that have to be there are G, the root, B, the third, F, the flat 7. That's enough to define it as a dominant chord with my root, my third, and my 7. That's called a shell. And then I add the flat 9. So that's only 4 notes that get me to satisfy the minimum requirements of a G7 flat 9, which means I have a lot of cool scale choices I can pick from. So by altering a dominant into a dominant 7 flat 9, I now open up some cool scale choices. Let me just show you one of them in this video, and that is what I call the tonic harmonic minor. Some people call this Phrygian dominant or Phrygian natural 3. That's not really important. The important thing is to just know that tonic means the key that we're in. So the 1 chord, the key that we're headed to. So if I'm doing a 5-1 progression, G7 going to C, I'm in the key of C because G is the 5 chord, C is the 1 chord. So I'm going to play C harmonic minor over the G7 chord, and it gets me a flat 9 because C harmonic minor, I'll play it in the tenor key, has an A flat in it. The 6th note of that scale is an A flat. Well, that A flat, when I play it over the G7 chord, is the flat 9. So if I have a good old-fashioned G7 chord and it's not altered, but that G7 chord is resolving to some type of C chord, I can treat it like a flat 9 chord, and I'm going to play my C harmonic minor scale over that G7 chord and turn it into a melody. Something like that. And now I'm incorporating a lot of color over that G7 chord. Super common substitution. So remember, anytime a dominant is going 5-1, you can treat that dominant like a 5-7 flat 9. Okay, Super hip chord substitution number 4 is when you're improvising, you can always substitute a 7 diminished 7 chord instead of a 5 dominant chord, a 5-7 chord. Okay, so let me break this down. So let's say I'm in the key of C major and I'm doing a G7 chord resolving to a C major 7 chord. Okay, a 5-to-1 chord progression. So the G7 is the 5. My substitution is going to be the 7 fully diminished 7. So in the key of C, I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 up my scale. The 7th note is a B. So now I'm going to build a fully diminished 7th chord from that B. B, D, F, A flat. And that chord is now going to be a substitute instead of my G7. So instead of going G7, C major, I'm going to go B fully diminished, C major, okay? And for those of you who are theory geeks, the reason this works is because B fully diminished, 7th chord, B, D, F, A flat, could be an upper structure of a G7 flat 9. Upper structure means the upper part of the chord without the root, minus the root. So a G7 flat 9 chord could be G, B, D, F, A flat. That's one way to voice on a piano or a guitar a G7 flat 9 chord. Well, again, if I go G, B, D, F, A flat, and I drop the G, what do I have left? B, D, F, A flat. There's my 7 fully diminished 7th chord. Okay, so what does this mean melodically? As I grab my saxophone, I think about a G7 chord going to a C major chord. I'm going to substitute instead of a G7, a B fully diminished. It gets me a cool, nice, exotic sound that I can play over that G7 chord now. And then I'll find a way to resolve that to a C major 7 chord, something like this. Or so now I've got a whole new chord. And if you want a scale to go with that, you could play your B diminished scale starting on B. That is the scale that goes whole step, half step, whole step, half step, repeat until you're back where you started. So that scale would fit with that chord. So there you go. Instead of doing a 5-7 chord, do the 7 fully diminished 7. Next, now we're going to cover one of the most common, one of the most popular, and one of the most talked about chord substitutions in jazz. If you haven't heard about it already, you will at some point soon. This is called a tritone substitution. So in jazz, whenever I have a dominant 7th chord and it's going 5-to-1, so for example, if I'm in the key of C, my 5 chord is G. So if I have a G7 resolving to a C major chord, I can tritone sub that G7 chord. What that means is I'm going to play the dominant chord a tritone away. A tritone is a fancy way of saying 3 whole steps. Tri meaning 3, tone being a synonym for a step, a whole step. So if I start on G and I go up or down 3 whole steps, either way will work. 1, 2, 3, up, I'm at a C sharp. If I go down, 1, 2, 3, I'm at a C sharp. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a C sharp dominant 7 instead of a G7 and resolve it to C major. So here's the G7 one more time going to C major. And then here is that C sharp 7. Very hip, very colorful. For those of you that are music theory geeks, why does this work? Because G7 and C sharp 7 share the same 3rd and 7, their roles are just swapped. So in a G7 chord, my root and my 3rd and my 7, those are what we call a shell voicing on a piano or a guitar. Those are the minimum information notes we need to identify a 7th chord. Minimum information. So it's enough to tell you the type of chord. So if I have a root, a 3rd, and a 7, that's enough to tell me the chord. In this case, it's a G, a B, and an F, because it's a major 3rd and a flat 7. That's enough information for me to know this is a G7 chord. So my 3rd and my 7 are B and F. If I do my shell voicing from C sharp, I get C sharp, F, B, root, 3rd, 7. So you notice C sharp 7 and G7 share the same 3rd and 7. They're just swapped. In G, for G7, the B is the 3rd, and the F is the 7th. For C sharp 7, the F is the 3rd, and the B is the 7th. Okay, so what does the substitution mean for me as a melodic improviser? What it means is that anytime I see a G7 chord going to any type of C major chord, I can play C sharp 7 and my C sharp dominant 7 melodic vocabulary instead of G7. So in a normal G7 going to C major, I'll play G vocabulary like this. Right, so there I played a G7 going to a C major melody, right? Or right? It's very diatonic, sounds good, nice melody. But listen to what happens when instead of that G7, I play a C sharp 7. Or so very, very, very powerful. It takes me to a cool, colorful sound by substituting that C sharp 7 instead of a G7 chord. If you need more help with topics like this and your goal is to get better at playing jazz, check out our Learn Jazz Standards Inner Circle. We learn a new jazz standard there every month, and you'll get access to all of our jazz courses and resources on everything you need to know, as well as access to our community of like-minded musicians, so you're not going it alone. Check out the link in the description below for more. And if you found this video helpful, I have another video linked on screen that you're definitely going to want to check out. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.